The Higher View, welcome. We are back.
Hello.
Today, and we have Jensine Victoria here with us. She's from California, lives in the Redding area, and has a huge heart and passion for equality and social justice issues. We were just discussing some things and getting caught up on her background and where she comes from. And this is another amazing contact that Julie's brought in for our interview. I know she has a ton to deposit in your spirit today. Hopefully one of these nuggets you'll grab a hold of and run with in your own community. But Julie, why don't you go ahead and introduce Jensine for everybody that doesn't know this beautiful woman.
Yes, absolutely, Jensine. It's so great to have you on here. You know, I was trying to figure out how we even came across one another, but I believe something showed up in my Facebook feed and I saw what you were doing in Redding for the March for the Equality. And because we are looking for, speakers on this topic, I was like, I'm just going to reach out to her and see, if this is something that you're interested in doing. And you graciously accepted. And then, of course, we had you send in your bio. And then there's a much more than obviously I was aware that you've been involved in. So I'm just going to read a little bit of this to you just so you guys can understand where she comes from. If you didn't see, there was a Reading March that took place in June, and Jensine was a part of that. And she did that with Tanasha, who is from Bethel, who I absolutely adore. I could listen to her.
I love her.
Just read a menu, and I would just be impacted.
Love
right?
her.
Mm-hmm. She has that voice that literally just like echoes and activates. And so if you guys don't know who Tanasha is, you need to look her up. But knowing that Jensine was co-laboring with Tanasha was super exciting to hear. So she graduated from Azusa Pacific, and she's been doing a lot of stuff in the cultural and racial equality. One thing that she also is she's kind of on the entertainment side as well. So she's got a plethora of just experience and knowledge in different areas. So Jensine, welcome to the Higher View. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
A little bit more about your background so I don't have to go into it and just kind of hear it from your own language. What called you to the study when you graduated high school? What was it that really kind of picked that area of study?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I remember when I was young, and I think I was 5 years old, and I was watching this video of Romanian children in a sewer sniffing glue. And I remember I brought my piggy bank to church, my entire piggy bank. And I was like, this is for the kids in Romania. And like, that's just always been my heart. And so I have done work with the homeless. I've done overseas longer term ministry with deaf kids in China. And I did, when I was 18, I went to India and worked with orphans, went to a leper colony. And, that was my dream as an 18-year-old, is to just help the poor, help anyone that really doesn't have equal opportunity. And then so when I went to college, like without a shadow of a doubt, like I was certain that I wanted to actually learn and grow in a area of study where I was able to actually learn how to create sustainable socioeconomic systems within a culture, so that it's not just charity, but it's actually creating reformation in the land. And that's just always been my heart. So I completed field research in urban LA, working with inner city youth. We visited sweatshops. We sat with Central American migrants seeking to cross the border at Casa de los Inmigrantes. And that was in Tijuana. And then studying the effects and causes of homelessness, human trafficking, dehumanization, unequal labor conditions, and even colonization, and how that affects some views of Christianity today. And it really reformed the way that I carry the gospel, because it gave me so much more of almost a humility, but even just an awakening to how we can carry the gospel in a way that it's not just information, but it's actually transformation. And that's what it should be, is the gospel shouldn't just be, a 7-day trip and we go back and we take pictures and we're like, that was amazing. It should be transforming the land. So whenever we go to a place, we should transform it. And it should be with the transformation of the locals, actually. So it's not us coming in and changing their culture, but it's us partnering with the locals to help them sustain what's going on.
So good. I know that's a couple of things there. One is, and don't hear what I'm not saying. But so many of the quote unquote mission trips, I think, a lot of times are kind of self-serving in the sense of, oh, look what I did. I did that. And I agree that, for our youth and stuff like that, and, they have the little short spring break trips or whatever. It's good to expose them, to the mission field. I just don't think that people can actually call themselves missionaries just because they went and played with, children for 5 days in Mexico or something. I do think it's great exposure, but I think the mainstream mentality with Christians oftentimes is that, kind of, guess what I did? I went and I checked this box off, and twofold in the sense that you are saying, I'm not going in there to try to make them like me, or Americanize them, if you will. And that was one of the things that we've discussed so many times with the Higher View. And as we're actually expanding globally, and we have a department that we're developing called, Evangelism Education.
Wow.
And it's about, bringing the kingdom into their culture so that they can carry the kingdom in their own culture and in their own religion, and they're, not try to take their culture away from them.
Right.
But explain how they can be added unto, right?
Yes.
Have the kingdom within their own culture and their own heart, because they're going to embrace the wholeness of who they are versus if there's something wrong with you. You need to be like me. It's, that add unto. So I love what you just said. I mean, those just in the little tiny bit that you've said, I'm like, yes, that so resonates. I love it. About your sustaining, creating more self-sustaining economy and whatnot within these places. That's really intriguing to me, because that's the whole, right, teaching them to fish, not just giving them a fish, right? So how are you doing that? How are you helping to do that?
Right. And so what we're doing right now is we've been talking about how to build community trust, especially in Reading. And that's a huge thing. Last week, I was interviewed with the Chief Police of Reading, along with Tinashe LeRae. And we talked about how to practically do that. And a lot of that is partnering with community stakeholders, right? You get involved with city management. You get involved with the local authority, which is the mayor, the chief, people who are doctors. We're partnering with doctors. We're partnering with attorneys and people who actually can do legislation and change policies and reform. So a lot of that is actually listening to what's going on. And also just being in a position of, hey, I just want to partner with what's already going on. I think the cry for justice has already started in 1988 at Caldwell Park, which is where we had our March for Justice. And just to preface, I directed the March for Justice with Tinashe LeRae and Eddie McAllister, who is part of the Shasta County Beloved community. And so we, put on this event, but there was already some, I would say, there are organizations who have already been working for justice. And one of them is the Shasta County Citizens Against Racism. And in 1988, there was a shooting, a Black and a white, I think it was a couple, and they were shot there. And that's where we marched. And so it's so interesting that was the place where we marched. And that was the place that formed that, if you would call it a coalition against racism in Shasta County. And, that was also the year when there was a lot of Asian refugees from the Mian, the Hmong. There's all these different Asian ethnic groups that started coming in as refugees. And there were a lot of racial slurs being said, leave our town, all of this stuff. And to see that, that's almost like like you see this like turning of time, and we're actually not just removing something from the land, but we're rebuilding.
Right. No, I love that, Jensine, because, it's about showing up and getting involved, whether that's showing up to a city council meeting, just being present. So you have that language. So when you do get to talk with the chief of police or a mayor, you are aware of what's already being discussed, because I think a lot of times people are intimidated by those conversations because they don't have the wherewithal to be able to bring to the table. And so just being able to be present and just listen to the conversation that's happening at the table is a huge first step to be able to build that community of trust, which is huge. I love that.
Absolutely.
So in regards, you mentioned a couple, I'm like today, especially, I mean, sometimes I'm like really abstract thought. Today, I'm like, for some reason, I'm so with practical thought. You're
Absolutely.
talking about, we all have those days, right? Some days we're like, woo, out here. And then the other days we're like, okay, let's talk real practical terms, because I think this is just such an important topic. And I think there's so many people that are like, what can I do? And they kind of disempower themselves because they're not informed, or they're intimidated, or, whatever. But you're talking about, partnering with the doctors and the mayors and law enforcement and the whole 9 yards, so that you're partnering with people that are legislating or have the ability to legislate. What legislation are you looking for in creating these sustainable communities and reform and rebuilding?
Yeah, so a lot of it has to do with transparency, not just with the police, but just with the city in general. What are we doing? How are we involving the community? And it has to be practical. Like you said, Melissa, we can't be abstract with this. It needs to be methodical. And so there are many cities that have already implemented a lot of change in terms of transformation with police brutality, like what happened with George Floyd. Looking at how can we actually start to have conversations, hard conversations, where we actually talk about, and, there's been conversations about defunding the police. I come from a line where my uncle is a police officer. And so, I am all about justice, but I'm also about partnering with the police department so that we are making sure that they have the tools they need to really do well, to be successful, to be taken care of as they're on the front lines. And so I feel like it's a very holistic view that we need to have. And so part of that is, we're looking at having a town hall next month, and we're going to invite the stakeholders. And that's where we can actually have conversations. We can ask the questions. We can say, how can we all be on the same page? How can we start having surveys so that the police know, how do people feel about us? Because if there's no community trust between the police and the citizens, actually studies show that citizens are less cooperative. And so the police have more work. And, if they are not funded well enough to be staffed, they need to have citizens that are willing to cooperate, that are willing to actually maybe even help them. And so in a lot of cities, there's what is called community policing. I don't know if you've ever heard of that. And Sacramento has something like that called, what did you say? Sorry.
Citizens on patrol.
Yes.
There's a lot,
There's in different cities, it's called different things. Stockton has a really good model of this. It's called, I believe it's the Stockton Peacekeepers. And so what they'll do is, they'll try to de-escalate things before the police comes in sometimes. And so they're partnering. It's a partnership. And it's understanding that we're all in this together because we all want the same thing. We all want justice. We all want peace. We all want our city to be safe. So it's understanding that. But I was also talking about this just on the radio last week. And we were talking about how do we start to bring reconciliation and healing? Because before there's trust, reconciliation actually needs to happen. And part of that is acknowledging past hurts. And like you were saying, a lot of people don't understand the civil rights movement because I don't know if you've noticed this, but a lot of the pictures of Martin Luther King are in black and white. And so a lot of this generation has kind of created this dissonance between literally Martin Luther King was just in the 1960s. It's not that long ago.
Not that long ago, yeah.
It's not, but people, especially like the millennial generation, which is my generation, in our 30s, 40s, we we make it so far away that when we hear the word racism, we're like, oh, that was in that black and white era. We don't have that here. I don't know what that looks like. That can't be me. And then we see George Floyd and we're like, oh, I didn't even know this even existed. And it's because a lot of these, and so I started posting some of the videos in color because I'm like, we need to understand that Jim Crow, the message of equality, and this is what the talk is called, is we haven't learned what equality means, because in the Jim Crow era, we said separate but equal. And everyone thought that was equality. No one questioned the term separate but equal. And so we're kind of learning what together and equal means.
Yeah. So good. That's so good. And there it's you hit on a few points there. So kind of I'm going to backtrack a little bit with the law enforcement and police reform. And my husband was a veteran law enforcement in California, in one of, actually at the time in his earlier days, second highest violent crime rate in the nation. We took second place to Oakland, and woo, that's a great thing to be excited about, right? Those stats are just terrible. Anyway, so it was Fresno, California, and at the time it was absolutely, awful. It was terrible, and the police department did a number of things right and wrong. But brought those stats down. Those were good stats to not be in the number 1 or number 2 place. But in the process, as the violent crime rate came down, in some of the things that they were doing to address that obviously wouldn't go over in this day and age, they had what was called the Violent Crime Suppression Unit. So it was literally full-time SWAT in almost like military gear in the highest crime, areas to keep it, subdued. It wasn't a long-term project, but it did bring things down so that they could come in and bring some other reform stuff. It was unfortunate. So like my husband, who was on SWAT and sniper and all that other kind of stuff, hostage negotiator, took a number of mediator classes. He became one of the instructors with the police department that were supposed to be creating these, more social awareness programs and all this stuff. And at the time, I personally think it was socially premature, in the sense that I don't even know how to put it. People were too against it, like, oh, well, I don't want a touchy-feely police department. And so the financial support really wasn't there. And so we got an idea out there, but it didn't really equip the officers. And at the time anyway, we didn't have officers that had more of a, social worker mentality, right? They were more they came out of situations like violent crime suppression units. And then they're like expecting them to all of a sudden be more on the social worker side of things without any really equipping. And the state wasn't funding that kind of stuff, And now I think that's at the point where we're at in needing police reform, is that we have a significant amount of law enforcement that their own needs aren't being met. I mean, a lot of people don't realize the PTSD and the stuff like this that's going on in law enforcement that are in high crime areas. We have, situations where law enforcement that are continually dealing with high crime areas aren't rotated into other areas of their community. And so they begin to build a bias based on their everyday interaction. We are not equipping our officers to be integrated into their community as a whole. And so, the defund the police, I understand the concept as far as, I'm just going to use round numbers. Let's say, you know, there's $1 million budget and people are seeing the $1 million is going towards, you know, salaries for the upper echelon of leadership and more guns. And so they're saying defund that, but really there needs to be more reform in regards to, I think we're in the time and season that that we're ready for a more educated, equipped, trained police force, not in the use of force as they typically focus on, but in the use of connection, if you,
yeah,
you know. So anyway, that's just, you know, in my opinion, coming from a, you know, law enforcement marriage background, in what I see so incredibly missing within law enforcement. Of course, I mean, you have to have a balance. I'm not saying that there can't be any training on use of force, because if you have somebody that does not know how to, you know, defend and protect, which is what law enforcement is supposed to do, then they're going to react. Because we equally see that, unfortunately, in
absolutely.
law enforcement, that I personally think that the whole George Floyd thing came from a law enforcement officer that was operating off of fear and adrenaline versus technique, you know. And when you look at the stats even of police officers' qualifications with their guns, we would all be terrified and not want them to have guns anymore. You know, like our joke in the house is like, they can't hit the side of a barn with a shotgun 10 feet away, you know, because they're not trained properly. They go once a year for their qualification. And so you have this fear and adrenaline that pops up, and then they do stupid things like we're seeing.
Absolutely. And what you've brought up is very vital to the conversation, because we do need to look at the inside of what do police officers go through? How are they recruited? What's the process like? We talked about that just last week with the chief of police. And I love, his name is Bill Schuler. And because my uncle, who's like my adopted father, actually has been in the force for 30 years, he's retired now. He's one of my heroes. And so seeing things like this on TV and then knowing what he's like, I've ridden his police car, you know? And so to me, I'm a lot more comfortable with the police than most people are, just because that hits home for me. But also seeing that the pain for the Black community is real. It's very real. You know, I've had friends and some relatives get, you know, falsely arrested by police officers. I've had them being manhandled. You know, my own brother, who looks, because I'm Polynesian, Chinese, I'm mixed with lots of different bloodlines. But my brother, when his head is shaved, he looks Latino, and he was arrested falsely. And it was by a police officer who wasn't in uniform, and he was just getting the mail. And as he was getting the mail, the police officer came up behind him and said, "You're under arrest." And he said, "For what?" He was like, "Put your hands behind your back right now," and started cussing him out, manhandling him, put the cuffs on. And then he ended up having to release him, because my brother literally was in town just visiting my mother, and was like, "What?" And he was so shaken. He was just so shaken by this. And that's still a legal thing, that they can literally arrest you just by, if you match a description, which he did not, and so they had to let him go. But seeing that there is a real pain, and with the Black community, a lot of times it's not just let me handcuff you and check you. A lot of times it's throwing them to the ground, and there's so many countless videos of them literally having no weapon. They just have a phone, and they're being thrown, they're being choked, they're being headlocked, and so I really do have a heart for this, and part of. And I know you said a lot of the Black officers are going through this training, but they don't have this social worker mentality. We've got to get out of that separation of police force and social work. They should be the same, because we're all working towards social justice, right? Including the police officers. And I don't like using police force as well, because, you know, we call it law enforcement, but it really is law protection, right? And so when we're protecting law, we're protecting peace. And so if we all have that same mentality, we will want to work towards that. And so part of that is learning the history. And so when I'm big on educating, because when you're educating, it changes your heart's desire and it changes your intent. And so part of that would be actually going into the history and learning that in 1965, there were Black officers that weren't even allowed to police in the white community. I'm not sure if you're aware of that.
Yeah.
But they actually had marked cars. So when they would pull up to the curb, everyone knew they were Black without even getting out of their car. They're like, oh, that's a Black officer. He can't even do anything. We'll just continue on. They were sergeants, there were detectives, and every time they found that there was somebody that was committing a crime that was white, they would have to call for an assist and wait. Can you imagine the danger that they had to, even put up with? Like if someone that was resisting them, they would just have to allow them to do whatever they wanted because they couldn't even touch them. And so 12 officers in St. Petersburg, Florida, one of them is still alive, which is amazing. But they got together and started saying, how can we change this? And they're police officers. They're all wanting the same thing as their white counterparts. But after Jim Crow laws were actually removed, the police department was not honoring the law. And so they were still making them use separate bathrooms. They're still making them drive separate cars. And so that was illegal. And so they decided to sue. And in 1968, August 1st, which is my birthday, they actually were allowed to start policing all neighborhoods. And we have to recognize that we came from that history because originally the police force was formed to be slave patrol. And of course, that's not their agenda now. But back in the colonialism, in slavery, it's a very real part of history that it's a fact. That's what a lot of them were, commissioned for. And so learning where the history comes from, those biases do translate generationally. It's taught in the home, even without words. Studies have shown that color biases start as early as 3 months old, which is insane. And they've done like the doll test with 5-year-olds. And so these biases, trying to break them when they've been hired as a police officer already, giving them a gun, it's almost like doing it backwards, right? We have to start in the homes. We have to start before they even become police officers, before they even choose that career. We shouldn't try to we're trying to do it backwards. We're trying to repair after it's been done. We should do preventative education. And that's what I'm all about. And that's what socioeconomic sustainability has to do with, starting from the ground and working up. And that's what I'm all about.
Right. Which is ideal, obviously, right. Starting in the home in anything that we're wanting reform, education, government, all of it. One of the things everybody probably gets sick of hearing me say is, as the family goes, so goes the nation. No matter what, everything needs to really start with the family. But we are in critical mass right now, and we have law enforcement that is all over, the nation, that we can't just say, okay, everybody's fired and we're going to wait for the newborns to grow.
No, we're not going to do that.
Years,
No, absolutely not. And so practically, what we've been talking about is actually putting them through some training on biases. And I don't know if you guys have ever watched 100 Humans, and I talk about this a lot, but it's on Netflix. It's amazing. They test social biases, not just on race, but on weight, on age. Like they'll put somebody that's older in the room, and they'll actually measure how far somebody will stand next to them. They'll measure behavior, body language. It's so cool. It's honestly, I've never seen a show like that. And it's 100 people who have no clue what they're being tested for. So they don't tell you you're being tested for age bias. They'll just say, go find the green ball. And they're like, okay. And along the way, they'll see somebody who's older and they won't even know they're being measured by that bias. But it's so cool. They took 100 humans that are all ages, all genders, all religions, all professions, Black, white, Asian, Hispanic, you name it. And they took them to a gun range, and fake guns, thank God. And they had one white person. Yeah, thank the Lord. They had one white person pop out with a gun and one Black person pop out with a cell phone. And they said, you have a short second to identify the enemy, and then you shoot. Right. Almost everybody shot the Black man, including Black people.
Wow.
And when the lights came on, the two individuals came out, and the white man was an actor, but the Black man was their friend. That was the kicker. And people were just crying. They were just like, I can't believe I would have shot my own friend in the split second. It's because we've demonized Black skin. Even the Black participants shot the Black man.
Right.
And you'll see that in the doll test. A lot of the Black kids, they'll say, who's the evil child? They'll point at the Black doll, even though they are Black themselves, because they've been taught that Black skin's evil, even as a Black person. And so translating this to the police, I think situational tests like this, like if they were all taken to a gun range and they did a situational test and they were like, oh my gosh, I have this bias.
Right.
You know what I mean? And so, and I don't know what I would do. And so while I was watching this, I'm like repenting, like, would I shoot the Black person? Like, would I? It's a real thing because you're given, like, it's so quick.
Right.
And I've heard of stories of
thought through. Yeah. It's just an instinctual, which, like you said, comes from grooming your whole life.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And so situational tests are big for practicality, right? What can we do now? Take everybody out for a situational test. I think more stringent mental counseling would be great. Not just grief counseling after they've shot somebody, but actually it should be routine. It should be routine. It should be standard. I think
just with shooting people, because I think that, I mean, just coming from being married to somebody that was like in SWAT and things, and you know, I could share some of the, like, Fresno PD, when there's a situation, they have multiple snipers and they all have to shoot at the same time, and they will not release the information or the ballistics to let the individuals know which one actually shot the person, you know, as that's like their form of mental protection. And they will have their little check boxes, if you will, of follow up with the psychologist, you know, but even in just, you know, 12-hour, all day, every day shifts in higher crime areas, or in areas where you don't have the trust, you don't have the respect, whatever, you end up with this more layered long-term PTSD type stuff. I mean, some of them is actual PTSD if they're in the, you know, high crime areas where they're continually, you know, their life is threatened. But even the small things that layer within law enforcement, they're not requiring them to have ongoing, like, psych evaluations, which, first of all, I think the psych evaluation on hiring is absolutely pathetic, but that's a whole nother story. You know, that needs to be upped, in my opinion. But the ongoing, you know, of all law enforcement, not just if they've been in a shootout.
Right. Absolutely. And that's what I was saying. A lot of them see domestic violence, and that's traumatic. Yeah. They come to crime scenes where people are already dead. Right. You know, one of the cops told me, and this is graphic, I'm sorry, but, you know, I have other people in the force, and they've seen dead bodies with worms crawling out. And that is so disturbing. And then the next day you're like, oh, go handle this. And so when we talk about defunding the police, we're actually realizing we need more resources to do a lot of these. We need more staff, counselors. You know, a lot of them are overworked and they're not able to get vacation. I lived with my uncle and I knew his schedule. I lived with him for a few years, and he was up at 4 a.m. and he came back late at night. And sometimes it was longer than that. And so, you know, and then after that, there's paperwork. It's not just you're on your feet, you're doing paperwork in the office. And so you're, you know, you go from one traumatic situation, then you're stuck to a computer and you're having to do all this random admin things. And then you go home and you're just trying to sleep so you can go back the next day. And where does it go? All of the emotion, the trauma, it stays in your body. It stays, trauma stays in your body. And it's, you know, we're expecting them to protect the peace. We're expecting them to really, you know, be all of these things. And then we're not giving them the tools to succeed. And so I do have a big passion for how can we do that. And part of that is having them be transparent with where their budget is being allocated. And I think a lot of people don't understand that the police actually need to have better funding because they're not showing where their budget's going. And with the Reading police, you know, when we were on the radio, and this is public information, so I can share, the chief was sharing that they actually got defunded a few years ago. And I go to Bethel and our church helped. We helped because we love the police force. And so, you know, and we didn't want them to start, you know, firing people because we were like, well, how can we help? How can we partner with you? Because that's part of us being a community. That's part of us being a church. And so when we look at this, we need to just sit down with the leaders and say, hey, what is your budget looking like? How does that look like staff-wise? Do you have this resources? Are you able to have these trainings? Because these trainings for racial biases, if we want them, we can't just slap it on and say, okay, here's another thing for you to do, police force. Bye. We need to give them the ample resources. We need to give them the staff. We need to give them, the counseling and all. And I know that some of them do have some of those already. I've been listening. They've talked about perhaps bringing somebody, and this is in Reading, from one of the social organizations to maybe actually ride with the police officer. So if they actually walk up to somebody that seems like it's a mental issue, they'll have that person de-escalate before bringing an officer in, because a lot of times, the badge represents harm sometimes, and it represents mistrust, right? And so we were talking about restoring public faith, which is what we were talking about, because that goes with community trust. How do we restore faith to where the badge becomes a thing of honor? Because how many of you, and I'm me included, when I'm pulled over by police, that's not my, I love my uncle, but if I don't know who this police officer is, there is some fear, right? There is a level of fear, and it's not like, oh, hi, it's so great to see you. Thanks for coming. But it's not that public faith. And so there is this guy, I forgot what his name is, but Tanasha was talking about him, and he actually does a lot. He'll pick people up in his car. And they'll call him Uncle so-and-so, and he'll bring them treats, he'll bring them candy, and he's humanizing the police force. And whenever they see him, it's so weird. They're running to him, hey, do you have any treats for me? Hey, how are you? Okay, see you next time. And that's what we should think of. And it's, of course, now to think of him the police force that way would be not, it's just not possible, because we still need to go through the steps of healing, and it is going to be a journey. It is going to be layered. It's not going to happen in a month or two or even a year. We've got to peel back the layers and really start to actually look at the wounds before we can even repair. And that's a process.
Yeah, on both sides. The wounds really on both sides. And it's unfortunate, excuse me. It's unfortunate that there are sides, right? It's unfortunate that, you have the police on one side and the community on the other side. Because I know that that's not the perfect situation. Like you said, it's definitely something that needs to come together, but the healing has to happen and the trust rebuilt. And this has been a generational thing, like you said, without going into detail or whatever. My family, if any of them are watching right now, they're gonna be laughing. But I grew up literally despising the police passionately, and had my fair share of interactions with them. And won't go into detail on that right now, but was negative. And if I had been a person of color, it would have, it would be more exasperated, but basically very similar situations. And so I absolutely despise law enforcement. And I can remember growing up and just seeing them drive down the street. I'd be giving them the middle finger as just because they exist.
Oh my gosh.
It was terrible. It was awful. So I understand. I understand the wounds and everything from that was created from bad cops. Really, it wasn't just because they existed, but that there were bad cops, and it perpetuated in the community that I grew up in was actually a small community. And so, which almost seemed worse, because it seemed like you had a higher concentration of crooked cops than good cops. And then back in that same day in the larger city we were attached to, which was Fresno, pretty much everybody knew, that there was a considerable amount of crooked stuff going on in law enforcement. And it took quite a few chiefs coming in and out to help get that cleared up. But when you have, it didn't matter that it was cleared up. Like by the time I met my husband and that's a whole nother story. My whole family was like floored. How in the world are you bringing a cop here? It didn't matter that he was a good cop and there were good cops, because for so long, there were so many bad ones.
Yeah.
And, since my video went viral, and I've been having so many more conversations with the African-American communities, and hearing that, when their little boys are 3, 4, 5 years old, they're giving them the talk.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so this is literally something that is generationally passed down of, don't trust the cops, and you have to act a certain way so that your life is spared. And somehow we have to step in and navigate stopping the talk, but yet we obviously want our Black men to be protected too. So, how do you navigate that? Because we don't have a magic wand that just all of a sudden makes the police department wonderful, right? But the two sides are going to have to navigate this at the same time. Coming into the family, and how do you say, well, you need to stop having that talk with your child at 3 or 4 or 5, because it's setting an expectation that the cops are bad. And then if they're 18 and they get shot and the mom wants to shoot me because she said I didn't teach my son how to protect himself. It's just dynamic. How are we navigating the two sides, letting down their guard enough to create any kind of healing and build trust?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I've thought about that. And as you were talking about it, I just put myself in the shoes of, if I had a Black child and if you had a Black child, would you give them some sort of framework for, hey, this is what you're walking into today. I want to let you know that these are real cases. Mm-hmm. You hold yourself with dignity because that's who you are. And I'm always for justice, but I would also say, be aware that there are some cops with racial biases, and they will treat you a certain way, and they will manhandle you. Like, my brother's been manhandled by a few cops. We had a break into her house one time, and the entire family, the entire group that broke into my dad's house was let go because they were white. Wow. Yeah, and they beat up my brother. Wow. And there was blood on the floor. And so I've seen real racism with the cops happening in my own family. And, I come from mixed blood. And so if I were to have a, Black child of my own, I would give him my version of the talk, because it's real. And I would not want him to walk in blindly into this world, because part of being wise, is be gentle, but also be wise.
Right.
Wisdom is saying, hey, son, as a Black man, there will be people who judge your skin before they judge you based on your character. And that's just a real thing. But also know that there are good cops that are going to be treating you fairly, that will speak up for you, that will say, hey, this is wrong. And so knowing that there's, not every cop is bad. And I would probably try to introduce him to any friends that I knew that were in law enforcement, just so he would know what a good cop is like. And so they need to have, a balance of not just every cop is bad, but they also need to know that's a reality, but also see, what is it like to have somebody that is in authority that is good. And so I also want to say, a lot of it doesn't have, some of it is racial bias, but some of it has to do with just when you give somebody power without them having the character to uphold that. And so I think a lot of people say it's, it's the white cop thing, but let's just also say that one of the cops was Asian. And I can speak to that, as somebody that does have some Asian descent. And, I took psychology in college. I took a few classes, and one of them was abnormal mind, brain, and behavior. And we watched an experiment of, it was like the cop experiment. And so they took, I think it was 20 individuals, college students, who were willing to do an experiment for 24 hours. And they said, all right, you're group B, you're group A. And they didn't know what they were doing. They said, okay, group A, we're going to give you fake guns and you're the cops. Group B, you are the citizens. And they locked them in the room for 24 hours, which I think is just so dangerous. And then they turned on the cameras and they were like, all right, we'll be back. Oh, by the way, that room over there is a jail. Bye. And they left. Wow. within 24 hours, they had tied up some people. They had did their own form of torture. They started like marching outside with their fake guns. I mean, thank God they weren't real. I'm telling you, all of these weird social experiments, you think they're weird, but it's actually what happens when you feel like you have power and you don't have the character, you don't have the integrity, you don't have the moral value. I mean, we're all Christian here, right? You would think that's enough, but sometimes just believing in God, you still need to know what authority can do to you if you partner with the wrong spirit, right? You partner with that spirit of pride, you partner with that spirit of control, manipulation, whatever it is. If you don't have that foundation and you're given, and that's not just with police, any sort of authority, you can use it. Even managers, you see that with managers, you see that with, and that's what they call it, like bad manager, blah, blah, blah. And then you give the manager a gun. Oh my gosh. And so this experiment, we were watching this and it was so hard to watch. Honestly, it was so hard to watch. And it was like all these hidden cams and I'm seeing them and they weren't beating them, but they're like yelling at them. And they're like, I don't even know what was going on in these people's minds, you know, but they're like, you guys are the evil ones. And they were just 10 minutes, like, you know, a few hours ago, they were just all strangers that walked into us, you know, an experiment. And they had literally just taken on these, like these roles. And I was just like, wow, this is what happens when you hand people authority without preparing them for it.
That's good.
Well, and that's why I'm talking about like the psych evals, you know,
absolutely.
That to me are just pathetic, because it is unfortunate that you have a mixture of people that are drawn to law enforcement. I mean, you have your public servant hearts that are drawn to law enforcement, you know, but then you also have a significant amount of people who have felt powerless throughout their life. And seek to have power.
Wow, interesting.
But they're not doing a good job of filtering those out before they even get onto the department. And I don't have a total solution other than I think they need to have more than just the simple psych eval, you know, which I understand as you're going through the psych eval, you're probably not thinking that it's really simple. Our federal level psych evals, because, you know, I do have family and people that are in federal level law enforcement is a whole different ballgame than local level psych evals, much more thorough. But I think that we could really change the face of law enforcement if they were to weed out as many as possible that are in there with the desire to have power and control, versus the people that are really have a desire to serve and protect.
Absolutely. And I think that, I mean, again, that's more admin work for the police force, right? And so when we talk about stages like this, we need more bodies. We need more humans that are going through this processing paperwork, because a lot of it is, and I was talking to the chief, is when they're recruiting, they do have a multi-layered system. They do evals, but then they also have multiple interviews, right?
Right.
And still, they somehow, and they've had to let a few people go. And they also talked about that on air, so I can say that. But through the years, you know, sometimes you don't know somebody's character until they just work for you. And I as a manager, I was a hiring manager for one of the companies, and I hired 25 staff, you know, and not all of them stuck. And some of them interviewed amazingly well. And I'm like, oh yeah, I have great discernment. I think I do, but I'm still human.
Right.
And, you know, you have to also recognize that some of these people, as many, we can hook them up to like a million lie detectors, and we can, at the end of the day, sometimes some people just really do slip through, but we can still do a better job. We can still do a better job, but we do need the funding for that. And so that again goes to, how are we allocating our resources? Are we putting more resources into gun training? Because we're giving them guns, we should make sure that they are trained, that they actually can aim, you know, that they know what they're doing. We need to actually do more situational tests, like if somebody tases you, because that was with Rashad. Rashad Brooks, I think that's his name, is, you know, how can we actually talk about situations like this So we don't have this stuff on the news before we figure it out. This actually becomes something that we train for.
Right.
Oh, okay, the taser's coming out. I was trained for this. This is what we're going to do.
Right.
Oh, he's resisting. I was trained for this. This is what we're going to do.
Right.
You know, oh, I see my officers, my co-partners knee on this guy's neck. I was trained for this. This is what I'm going to do. And
Right.
so like we need to have things like this.
Yeah.
But it is real, you know, and I do want to go back to some of the biases. And I know we were talking, seeing some of the comments, is one of the guys said, this is how I would train my son. And that really, it breaks my heart, Derek, that you would have to train your son for this. And, you know, I think about a lot of Black men say they can't wear a hoodie. They can't wear a hoodie and walk around at night because to them, you know, a cop can pull them over for doing something because they're wearing a black hoodie. And there's this, I don't want to spoil it, but there's this thing by Procter and Gamble. They've been doing a lot of things, and one of them is called The Look, and it's amazing. There's this guy, and they're showing him walking into different stores and the looks he gets. And I've gotten the look as someone that is not, you know, I look different ethnically, and people usually can't figure me out, but they'll sometimes stare at me and I'll say hi, and they won't even say hello. They'll just be like, you know, and I've gotten that several times, and they don't know I have degrees. They don't even care. If I have money in the store, I might have more money than most of the people. They don't care about that. They just care that they don't identify with me and that they don't want to say hello. And a lot of it's people that work there, you know, and they just won't talk to me. And so there's this video, and it's nonverbal, and it just shows all the looks he's getting from people of the white community. Wow. And he's going to all these different places, and in some places he's wearing a hoodie, in some places he's wearing a suit, and at the end it shows his profession. He's a judge. And but because he's wearing a hoodie, you know, walking on the street with his son, like in New York, people don't know who he is. They see a Black man, and that's all they see. And and we have to get back to the basics of what do you see when you see your brother. And so, and I know I'm like going in all these different spots, but again, all of this.
So it's kind of hard to not go all.
It's such a large, it's such a large topic. And I know we've talked about the police, but I kind of want to zoom out for a little bit. And this is what I was talking about when we were doing the community trust, is it's not just about the police. Because we can focus on the police. We can ham in on the police. Police need to change. Police, and I love the police. They do have some work to do. But if we zoom out, police are just a piece of the pie when it comes to racial equality. If we talk about equality, we have to talk about housing, redlining, education. A lot of the actual, like Jim Crow, all of that, we aren't having proper history taught in our schools. We need to talk about family. We need to talk about medical care. You know, the birth rate for African-American women is lower, is actually the mortality rate is higher because they're not getting equally treated by doctors. A lot of times doctors don't listen to African-American women while they're making requests. They're like, oh, I'm feeling this. They'll be like, okay. And they just don't take them seriously. And so we even need to do some bias testing in the medical field. And that's why we're bringing in doctors. We're bringing in, you know, teachers, because some teachers treat their kids differently. And I was watching Ruby Bridges on Disney. She's one of the first Black girls to be integrated into school, and seeing how the teachers treated her based on her skin. And she's so smart, one of the smartest kids. She was smarter than a lot of the white kids in the school. And the principal wanted to lower her rates to match the white kids, lower her grades to match those of the white kids, because she was so incredibly smart. They're like, there's no way a Black girl can be this smart. And so we've kind of, you know, and I don't know if you guys have heard about Black Wall Street, but, you know, in Tulsa, you know, there was this place called Black Wall Street, and the Black community had they had their own shopping centers, they had their own hospitals, they had their own doctors, they had their own attorneys. There were millionaires there. And because of a conflict that arose, the white community actually burned down and looted a lot of their stores. And overnight, 9,000 Black people became displaced, and we had no social welfare for them. At that time, we didn't have food stamps. We did not have HUD housing. We didn't have any of that. And so they were literally just on the streets on their bare backs, not even with any cardboard, just on the ground. Some of them died of starvation. And so a lot of times I'm seeing the Black community trying to rise up. They're actually the most progressive people group. If you study Black people, it's only been since 1965, 68, since the Jim Crow era actually was dismantled. But the mindset has carried on for the last 50 years. The mindset, think about it, 60 years is not even the full lifetime of a human, if you think about that. And to see within those 60 years, there's been a Black president. So there's so much growth in the Black community. If you care to kind of like look at how it's grown historically, they keep coming up. They keep coming up. And so if we zoom up, it's all about revival, right? Is when we learn to speak the language of our brother, we actually learn to speak the language of revival. We learn to speak the language of heaven. And how do we do that? And so that's what this whole conversation about community trust with the police officers. How do I speak your language? How do I learn your history so I can love you? So I can actually get down to the root issue, because all of these issues that we're seeing with the Black community, they started with the root. And the pain is still there. And that's why it's still coming out with all the marches and the protests and the looting, is because the pain, they don't feel heard. A lot of them don't feel heard and they don't feel seen. And so part of the police action would be to recognize, and that's why I was talking to the chief, and that's what he's been doing when he goes to the marches. And I love Chief Schuler. He is, I mean, if you see him, he is so kind. When he goes up there, he acknowledges the pain. And not every officer will, it's very humbling. But we've also been talking about white people feeling like it's their fault. And we're not saying it's their fault. We're saying it's something that they've inherited, right? So and even I, as someone who is mixed and Islander, I've inherited this problem. And that's why I feel responsible for being part of the conversation, because it's my responsibility as someone that was born in America.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting when you talk about that. I live in a small community, and our kind of police force has taken a different approach in that they have put on a couple of events for the community where it's a barbecue, a community barbecue. They sponsor it. They provide all the food. They bring the entertainment, just to bring our small community together and just be present, so people get to know them, to get to know their heart. So I think it is something where, you know, really just kind of being strategic on how to start forming those relationships. That it's unfortunate because a lot of, you know, bad cops taint the good cops. Mm-hmm. And, you know, as a female, you always have that question in your mind, like, okay, if I'm driving home all by myself at night and here comes these sirens behind me, what do I do? Because you've heard of these instances where women, you know, are taken advantage of. Mm-hmm. And so I have a lot of police officer friends, and they continue to tell me, Julie, you have the right to get to a spot where it's lit up. So you just turn on your flashers and you can drive to show that you acknowledge that you are being pulled over. But yet you don't feel safe to get pulled over on the side of the road. Because that's always been my fear. And I don't know if people know that, but we do have a right. If we are a female traveling by ourselves and it's late at night and we get pulled over on a highway or a really dark space, we acknowledge that we are getting pulled over and we drive to a lit space, whether it's a gas station. Because that's a protection for us as women, especially when we're by ourselves. Because you don't want to run from the cops. But, you know, adrenaline just starts racing, not only because you're getting pulled over, but, oh my gosh, who is this? I'm by myself. I feel vulnerable. I don't know what to do.
Absolutely. And I think you can also call a police department and verify their badge. Because there have been cops that have impersonated, or not cops. There's been citizens that have impersonated cops. That's what I meant to say. And so I think you can call and say, hi, you know, I'm on such and such intersection. There is a police officer behind me. I just wanted to verify that he's one of yours, you know, just see that. And that could be also another thing. That's a great thing to add, especially since as a female, I do see how that could be really nerve-wracking too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think, you know, we're going to have to wrap up here, but if we want to like really zoom out and see really what we're talking about in regards to solution is two things. One is relationship. As relationships are formed with individuals, you know, that those individuals create a collective, right? It's not just that you're seeing the law enforcement out there and they're doing something, but actual law enforcement getting involved in creating relationships with individuals within the community, et cetera, and education on both sides, you know.
Yeah.
And combining the power of relationship and education in all aspects, whatever it is that we're wanting to change in this world. I think that that's really the key. You know, God was all about relationships. The whole reason why we exist is He wanted relationship.
100%. And there's actually so much hope. And I just wanted to end with this is, you know, we can see all the problems, but we can also see that there's a lot of solutions being done right now, especially this is historical, being able to do a town hall in Redding, California, with the mayor, with the chief police. We've never had conversations like this publicly on air, you know, where we're actually like, the march was historical too. And so George Floyd was kind of that, you know, everybody was jumping on it, but these cities have been crying for this for a long time. And I'm seeing a lot of great things happening too. And we just have to continue to dig in and continue to actually, like you said, connect with each other and see that the Lord is actually in this. And there's such a grace in this season to connect with each other, to actually see each other well, and to hear from the Lord and get divine strategy.
Yeah, absolutely.
So good. Well, so then, Jensine, how can people find out more about what you're doing, or is there kind of a coalition that you're forming, or how do they get connected with you?
Yeah, well, they can actually go on the Shasta Beloved, I think it's Shasta Beloved County Community, or they could actually go on my Facebook if they wanted to just add me or follow me there. We are starting a citizens committee, but it's more of just for our actual city because we're focusing on doing structural change within the city. But yeah, I do post some updates on my Facebook, and once some of it's still not super public, I'll post more updates more on the actual policies and things that we're doing in our city.
Yeah, because I think it would be really great for people to be able to watch what you're doing, so it gives them ideas that they can come back and bring to their community. You know, I think it's a lot of that's that education piece, right? Where a lot of people will feel disempowered, or what in the world can I do? And if they actually are able to see what you are doing and take those ideas back to their community, that would be absolutely amazing. So, thank you so much for
coming on. Thank you for having me. I really loved it.
Yeah, that was so good. It's so good, so much. I know we could do a million of these probably because the topic is so big. But thank you for coming and sharing. And we look forward to following you and everything that you're going to be releasing that, you know, isn't just going to stay in Redding, because people, you're going to inspire people, and people are going to take that into their own community. And, you know, a few years from now, we'll have this conversation again. And I know we're going to be seeing and hearing such different stories. So
yes, amen. And bless you all. And thank you for even having these conversations. I know they're tough, and you are all hosting so much. You're such a part of this. And I just want to say, like, everybody has a different part that they play. And so when you say, what can I do? You're doing it. You're actually bringing awareness to many different cities just by having these conversations. You're opening up a lot of discussions that most people are afraid to open up. And you're doing it very well with grace and with so much wisdom. And Melissa, thank you for even sharing your insight. And Julie, thanks for having me. And Elizabeth, I didn't get to hear much about you, but thank you for meeting you anyway.
Okay, everybody be blessed. Bye. And THB Nation, we'll see you tomorrow.
See you.
Bye.